4 years, Buckingham Palace survived on silence. Not the peaceful kind the public imagined when cameras flashed outside royal gates, but a colder silence, one built on restraint, hierarchy, fear, and secrets buried so deeply inside the monarchy that even senior staff learned never to speak about them aloud. Behind the polished ceremonies, the royal smiles, and carefully rehearsed public appearances, tensions had been quietly growing for a very long time. But according to insiders close to palace operations, nobody expected the fracture to finally explode over something as deceptively simple as a door. It happened on an afternoon that initially appeared completely ordinary inside Buckingham Palace. Security rotations moved on schedule. Senior aides carried folders through private corridors. Protection officers monitored restricted entrances with the same disciplined routines repeated every day for decades. Nothing outwardly suggested that within minutes, one decision would send shock waves through the highest levels of the monarchy itself. Then Meghan arrived. Sources claimed her vehicle approached one of the palace's most restricted private access points, an entrance traditionally associated with working senior royals and individuals still considered fully trusted inside the institution. To outsiders, it would have looked insignificant. Just another secured doorway hidden behind royal walls. But inside palace culture, that entrance represented something far more powerful than convenience. It symbolized status, protection, acceptance, belonging. And according to multiple insiders, Meghan allegedly expected routine clearance without resistance, the same quiet access that had once been granted without hesitation. But this time, something changed. The officers stationed near the entrance reportedly paused. At first, witnesses believed it was a technical delay, perhaps confusion with schedules or last-minute coordination issues. Yet the atmosphere shifted almost immediately when security radios began crackling across the corridor. Staff members who had spent years inside palace operations suddenly stopped moving. Aides exchanged nervous looks. Protection officers reportedly requested confirmation more than once, stunned by the instruction appearing on internal channels. Because the order carried a name nobody expected to hear. Princess Anne. Not King Charles. Not Prince William. Not Palace Communications. And herself. According to insiders, the command had arrived only moments earlier, delivered quietly but with unmistakable authority behind it. No emergency meeting. No debate. No negotiation. Just a direct instruction that Meghan was not to be granted access through that restricted entrance. And within seconds, one of the monarchy's most protected internal spaces became the center of an explosive royal crisis unfolding entirely behind closed doors. What shocked palace staff most was not only the decision itself, but the fact that it came from Anne. For decades, the Princess Royal built a reputation unlike almost anyone else inside the royal family. She rarely sought attention, rarely involved herself in emotional public disputes, rarely allowed personal feelings to interfere with royal structure. Even critics admitted and operated with almost military discipline when it came to monarchy protocol. That reputation made the incident feel even more dangerous. If someone as controlled and restrained as Anne had reached the point of direct intervention, insiders feared the tensions behind palace walls were far worse than the public had ever imagined. Witnesses later described an uncomfortable silence spreading through the corridor as officers realized the order would not be reversed. Several aides allegedly froze in disbelief while trying to determine whether exceptions might still be made privately at the last second. But according to palace sources, Anne's position only hardened. Calm. Immediate. Uncompromising. And as Meghan reportedly remained waiting outside those restricted doors, whispers began racing through Buckingham Palace that the Princess Royal had finally reached her breaking point after years of buried frustration. Because behind the scenes, insiders claimed resentment inside the monarchy had been growing for far longer than anyone publicly admitted. Every interview, every accusation, every leaked private disagreement, every public attack against royal structure had allegedly deepened tensions between working royals and those who walked away from official duties. While the public continued consuming headlines filled with family drama and emotional speculation, palace staff reportedly witnessed something much darker unfolding internally, a slow collapse of trust. according to aides familiar with palace operations, and viewed loyalty as absolute. To her, monarchy survival depended on discipline, silence, sacrifice, and rigid institutional boundaries. Once those boundaries weakened, everything became vulnerable. Sources claimed she privately warned senior figures months earlier that exceptions and emotional compromises were slowly eroding the authority holding the monarchy together. At first, many dismissed those concerns as old-fashioned rigidity from one of the last royals fully shaped by the institution's older traditions. But now, insiders feared and believed she had been proven right. What made the situation even more explosive was the timing. Tensions inside the palace were already dangerously fragile. King Charles was reportedly struggling privately to contain growing fractures between royal households while also protecting the crown from another devastating public crisis. Prince William, meanwhile, had allegedly become increasingly focused on institutional stability over emotional reconciliation. Palace observers quietly noticed changes in recent months. Firmer conversations surrounding royal duty, stricter internal boundaries, less tolerance for unpredictability. Some insiders even whispered that a new phase of monarchy leadership was beginning to emerge behind closed doors, one less emotional, less forgiving, and far more focused on survival at any cost. Then came the detail that truly terrified senior staff. According to multiple palace sources, Prince William was informed about the confrontation almost immediately after it unfolded. Yet there was reportedly no outrage from his side. No demand for reversal. No visible attempt to challenge Anne's authority. That silence changed everything inside palace corridors. Because within royal culture, silence is rarely meaningless. Silence can protect. Silence can approve. Silence can warn. And according to insiders, many palace aides quietly interpreted William's lack of intervention as indirect support for the deeper principle and was defending. Not necessarily every emotional consequence, but the belief that royal structure itself could no longer survive without harsher boundaries. That realization reportedly sent panic spreading through communications offices and administrative teams already terrified another family fracture might explode publicly at any moment. Some aides allegedly feared Harry would interpret the restriction not as protocol, but as deliberate humiliation aimed directly at him and Meghan. Others worried even more dangerous consequences were approaching. New leaks, retaliatory interviews, another brutal wave of public warfare between the Sussex household and the institution itself. Staff members reportedly spent hours preparing contingency responses for headlines they prayed would never appear. But even amid the growing panic, Anne refused to step back. According to sources close to palace operations, she insisted protocol could not collapse every time emotional pressure intensified. To her supporters inside the monarchy, this was not cruelty. It was discipline. They argued and believed the institution had already sacrificed too much authority in attempts to preserve peace publicly while internal divisions deepened privately. Yet critics inside palace walls saw something colder emerging. Some feared the monarchy itself was beginning to transform into a far harsher institution, one increasingly willing to sacrifice emotional reconciliation for structural control. And as the hours passed, another terrifying realization slowly spread among those closest to the crown. This confrontation was never truly about a doorway at all. It was about trust. About power. About who the monarchy still considered fully inside the institution, and who it no longer did. Because according to insiders, behind Princess Anne's cold instructions stood years of resentment, fear, and growing frustration that had finally reached a point where silence itself was no longer enough to contain the damage spreading behind palace walls. And what happened next reportedly pushed tensions inside the royal family even closer to total collapse. Prince Harry reportedly learned about the confrontation later than almost everyone else inside Buckingham Palace, and according to insiders, that delay alone immediately triggered suspicion. By the time the message reached him, palace staff had already spent hours scrambling behind closed doors trying to contain panic spreading across royal offices. Protection teams had quietly adjusted procedures. Senior aides were allegedly moving between corridors carrying sealed updates. Communications officials monitored media channels in fear that details might leak before the palace could regain control of the situation. But the deeper problem was no longer the blocked entrance itself. The real danger now centered around how Harry would interpret what had happened once he discovered who stood behind the decision. According to sources close to the palace, his reaction was immediate, emotional, and far more explosive than several senior figures expected. At first, insiders claimed Harry believed the restriction had originated from lower-level palace administration or temporary security confusion. But the moment he allegedly learned Princess and personally authorized the enforcement, the emotional atmosphere shifted completely. Because Anne was never viewed as a casual participant in royal conflict. She was seen as one of the monarchy's most disciplined protectors, someone who avoided emotional drama unless she believed the institution itself had been threatened. That realization reportedly hit Harry harder than the restriction itself. According to palace aides familiar with internal conversations, Harry interpreted Anne's involvement as a symbolic message from the monarchy's inner core, one suggesting that trust between both sides had collapsed much further than anyone publicly admitted. Sources claimed he became deeply frustrated not simply because Meghan had allegedly been denied access, but because of what the denial represented within royal culture. Inside Buckingham Palace, access has never been just about movement through buildings. Every corridor, every office, every restricted entrance silently communicates status, trust, and institutional standing. To suddenly enforce those boundaries against Meghan reportedly felt, to Harry, like public confirmation that the palace no longer considered them part of the protected inner structure they once belonged to. And according to insiders, that emotional realization reopened years of buried resentment almost instantly. Staff members described the atmosphere inside royal communications offices becoming dangerously tense as private calls reportedly escalated behind closed doors. Voices were allegedly raised. Frustration intensified. Some aides feared another devastating cycle of leaks, accusations, and retaliatory media warfare was only hours away from erupting publicly. One insider claimed several palace officials privately admitted they had not witnessed this level of internal anxiety since earlier family divisions exploded across international headlines years earlier. Because beneath the immediate confrontation, everyone understood something far more dangerous was happening. The remaining trust holding the royal family together appeared to be collapsing in real time. What reportedly made Harry's reaction even more emotional was the silence from senior royals afterward. According to sources, he expected someone, anyone, to publicly soften the incident once tensions escalated internally. Some palace aides assumed Prince William might quietly intervene behind the scenes to calm the situation before it spiraled further. Others believed King Charles would eventually seek compromise in order to avoid another public fracture damaging the monarchy's reputation. But hours passed, then longer, and no visible intervention came. No correction. No denial. No emotional reassurance from the palace hierarchy. That silence reportedly deepened Harry's frustration more than direct confrontation would have. Because inside royal culture, silence often carries meaning stronger than statements themselves. To insiders watching the crisis unfold, the lack of public resistance toward Anne's decision created a devastating perception that senior royals may have privately agreed with her position even while avoiding direct public ownership of the fallout. Sources claimed Harry increasingly feared the confrontation was not an isolated incident at all, but part of a larger institutional shift quietly unfolding behind palace walls. A shift where emotional reconciliation mattered less than control, hierarchy, and long-term preservation of royal authority. And according to insiders, that fear only intensified after whispers began circulating about additional reviews tied to access privileges, protocol enforcement, and boundaries surrounding non-working royals. Suddenly, the blocked doorway no longer looked temporary. It looked symbolic, permanent, even. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace itself reportedly entered quiet crisis mode. Senior aides allegedly held private discussions about how to contain growing instability before another global media storm erupted. Communications teams monitored journalists. Legal advisors reportedly prepared for possible public fallout. Some insiders even claimed contingency plans were quietly reviewed in case tensions between royal households deteriorated further in the days ahead. What frightened palace officials most was the unpredictability surrounding what either side might do next. Because despite the monarchy's carefully polished public image, insiders described the emotional atmosphere internally as deeply fractured and increasingly impossible to stabilize. Yet amid all the fear, one figure reportedly remained completely unmoved: Princess Anne. According to sources close to palace operations, she refused to reverse the instruction even after emotional tensions intensified behind closed doors. That refusal stunned several senior officials who assumed pressure from escalating family conflict would eventually force compromise. Instead, and allegedly became even firmer. She reportedly argued that royal protocol could not survive if emotional reactions repeatedly overrode institutional boundaries every time conflict emerged. To her supporters inside palace circles, this was proof of strength, discipline, and loyalty to monarchy survival. But to critics, it looked dangerously cold. Some insiders quietly feared and had crossed an invisible line, transforming what could have remained a private disagreement into a symbolic power statement capable of reshaping family relationships permanently. According to palace aides, even King Charles struggled privately with the growing tension. Sources claimed the king felt trapped between two impossible responsibilities: his role as father and his duty as monarch. On one side stood Harry, still his son despite years of public fracture and emotional distance. On the other side stood an institution increasingly consumed by instability, leaks, media warfare, and collapsing internal trust. Insiders described Charles as emotionally exhausted behind closed doors, desperate to avoid another devastating royal crisis while simultaneously fearing that reversing Anne's position could weaken already fragile authority within palace operations. That internal conflict reportedly left the palace frozen during some of the most emotionally volatile hours since earlier divisions first exploded into public view. But perhaps the most unsettling development came afterward, when whispers began spreading that Anne's decision may not have been driven by emotion alone. According to several senior insiders, private concerns had allegedly been growing inside palace security circles for months before the confrontation ever happened. Concerns surrounding restricted entrances. Concerns about inconsistent enforcement. Concerns about blurred lines between personal family relationships and institutional protocol. And as fragments of those discussions quietly leaked through palace corridors, the narrative surrounding Anne's actions suddenly became far more complicated than simple personal resentment. Because if the Princess Royal had truly acted partly out of security fears tied to monarchy operations themselves, then the blocked entrance was not merely symbolic humiliation. It was something much larger, much colder, and potentially far more permanent than anyone outside Buckingham Palace yet understood. And according to insiders, what palace security teams allegedly uncovered weeks earlier may explain why Anne refused to back down even when the entire royal family risked collapsing into another public disaster. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the next chapter reveals the private security fears allegedly hidden inside Buckingham Palace, and why some insiders believe Princess Anne acted before an even bigger royal crisis could explode publicly. In the days after the confrontation, Buckingham Palace reportedly changed in ways outsiders would never notice, but insiders felt immediately. Corridors once filled with routine conversation became quieter. Meetings moved behind sealed doors. Senior aides allegedly lowered their voices whenever certain names entered discussion. Even long-serving staff members who had survived decades of royal scandals privately admitted the atmosphere now felt different, heavier, colder, almost as if the institution itself had entered a defensive state. Because according to multiple palace insiders, the blocked entrance incident did not end when Meghan was denied access. In many ways, they claimed, that moment was only the beginning. What truly alarmed officials behind closed doors was the sudden emergence of internal security concerns that had allegedly been hidden from public view for months. At first, many staff members believed Princess Anne's decision had been purely emotional, a reaction fueled by years of frustration, mistrust, and public damage surrounding the monarchy. But then whispers reportedly began circulating through palace protection offices about confidential reviews conducted quietly before the confrontation ever happened. Sources close to internal operations claimed certain restricted entrances connected to working senior royals had already become the subject of private security discussions weeks earlier. Not because of immediate danger, insiders stressed, but because of growing discomfort surrounding blurred lines inside palace procedures. According to those sources, some members of royal protection teams had allegedly become increasingly uneasy with inconsistent enforcement tied to non-working royals, private arrangements, and symbolic privileges that no longer clearly matched institutional status. And inside Buckingham Palace, Inconsistency is not viewed as a minor administrative issue. It is viewed as vulnerability. That detail reportedly changed how many palace aides interpreted Anne's actions entirely. Suddenly, the Princess Royal no longer appeared impulsive. She looked deliberate, calculated, prepared. Sources claimed and had privately supported tighter internal boundaries for months, believing the monarchy's survival depended on restoring discipline before confusion surrounding access, protocol, and authority weakened the institution even further. To her supporters inside palace circles, this was not personal revenge against Meghan or Harry. It was institutional protection. They argued and feared emotional exceptions had slowly eroded the rigid structures that once kept royal operations stable and secure. But not everyone inside the palace accepted that explanation completely. Some insiders allegedly believed security concerns were real, yet only partially responsible for the confrontation. Others suspected the operational justification simply gave official cover to frustrations that had already been building emotionally for years. That division quietly intensified tension throughout palace offices because staff members themselves no longer agreed on what the blocked entrance truly represented. Was it necessary enforcement of protocol? Or had personal resentment disguised itself as institutional duty? According to insiders, even senior aides privately debated where the line between security necessity and emotional retaliation actually ended. Meanwhile, Princess Anne reportedly refused to soften her position. Sources claimed she repeatedly framed the matter not as punishment, but as consistency. If restrictions existed for some individuals, she allegedly argued, then emotional history and family relationships could not override those rules whenever pressure intensified publicly. That logic resonated strongly with several palace security officials who had reportedly grown frustrated with unclear expectations surrounding royal access over recent years. Some officers privately admitted maintaining operational consistency had become increasingly difficult amid ongoing public tensions surrounding the Sussexes and the monarchy itself. And as whispers spread deeper through Buckingham Palace, another disturbing fear reportedly began taking hold among senior staff. What if the blocked entrance was only the first visible sign of broader institutional changes already underway? According to insiders, quiet reviews surrounding privileges, movement, staffing, and protocol enforcement allegedly intensified in the days following the confrontation. Nothing dramatic publicly. No official announcements. No visible punishments. But internally, sources described a noticeable tightening across multiple palace operations. Discussions reportedly became more formal. Sensitive communication grew more restricted. Access conversations were allegedly treated with greater caution than before. Some aides quietly feared the monarchy was entering a new era where emotional flexibility would be sacrificed entirely in favor of rigid structural control. What shocked palace staff even more was the growing silence from figures who might once have opposed Anne's severity. According to sources close to royal operations, several senior royals who privately disagreed with harsh confrontation nonetheless stopped resisting her position altogether. That silence deeply unsettled administrative teams because within royal culture, absence of opposition often signals something more powerful than direct support. It signals alignment. And insiders increasingly feared a new institutional alliance was quietly strengthening behind palace walls, one centered around survival, discipline, and restoration of authority at any cost. Prince William's role reportedly became central to those fears. According to palace aides, the future king had grown increasingly focused on long-term monarchy stability following years of public crisis, media warfare, and internal distrust. Sources claimed William privately admired Anne's discipline, particularly her refusal to allow emotional pressure to weaken institutional boundaries. While some insiders insisted he did not support every aspect of the confrontation emotionally, many believed he quietly agreed with the deeper principle behind it. The monarchy could no longer survive endless instability without firmer control. That perception reportedly spread rapidly across palace corridors after William continued avoiding any visible public intervention regarding the incident. And inside Buckingham Palace, silence at that level rarely happens accidentally. Catherine's silence reportedly carried equal significance. According to insiders, the Princess of Wales remained intensely focused on protecting stability for the future monarchy her children would eventually inherit. Palace staff allegedly noticed what some described as a new firmness developing among senior royals close to William and Catherine, less emotional flexibility, more emphasis on duty, control, and long-term institutional survival. To many inside palace walls, it felt as though the next generation of monarchy leadership was already taking shape quietly behind closed doors. A colder structure. More disciplined. Less willing to prioritize emotional reconciliation when institutional authority felt threatened. Meanwhile, Prince Harry and Meghan reportedly viewed the silence surrounding Anne's actions as confirmation of something devastating. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, they increasingly feared the blocked entrance was not a temporary procedural dispute at all, but part of a broader message from the monarchy itself. Boundaries were changing permanently. That perception allegedly deepened emotional fractures between both sides faster than palace officials could contain them. Communications teams reportedly entered full crisis preparation mode behind the scenes, fearing another cycle of explosive interviews, damaging leaks, or emotionally charged public retaliation could erupt at any moment. Some aides privately admitted they no longer knew whether reconciliation between both sides remained realistically possible. Others feared the institution itself had crossed a psychological point of no return. Yet the most chilling realization reportedly came at the end of the week, when senior palace insiders began quietly acknowledging something few dared say aloud before. Princess Anne's authority inside royal operations had grown dramatically stronger after the confrontation, not weaker. Instead of isolation, her firmness allegedly earned increasing respect among officials terrified about the monarchy's future stability. Some insiders even described her as becoming one of the crown's last uncompromising defenders during a period when internal trust appeared dangerously close to collapse. And according to sources, that growing influence may soon reshape far more than access to a single palace doorway. Because behind Buckingham Palace walls, fears were now spreading that the monarchy itself was preparing to redraw the invisible line separating who still belonged fully inside the institution, and who no longer did. By the end of the week, Buckingham Palace no longer felt like the same institution many staff members had served for decades. According to insiders, something fundamental had shifted behind the royal walls after the confrontation surrounding Meghan's restricted access. The tension was no longer temporary. No longer emotional chaos that could be smoothed over with carefully written statements or staged public appearances. What frightened senior aides most was the growing realization that the monarchy itself appeared to be hardening from the inside. Conversations became shorter. Meetings reportedly turned more secretive. Trusted staff members allegedly noticed an atmosphere of caution spreading through palace corridors unlike anything they had experienced since earlier royal fractures exploded onto the world stage years ago. And at the center of it all stood King Charles, privately struggling with a crisis that insiders claimed was becoming impossible to contain. According to sources close to palace operations, the king spent days attempting to preserve calm behind closed doors while balancing two responsibilities that increasingly seemed impossible to reconcile. One was deeply personal, his role as a father watching the relationship with Prince Harry deteriorate even further after years of emotional distance, public conflict, and growing mistrust. The other was institutional, his duty as monarch to protect the crown during one of the most unstable periods the modern royal family had faced in decades. Palace aides reportedly described Charles as emotionally exhausted, caught between compassion and control while the institution around him demanded firmness from every direction. Some insiders claimed the king privately feared that reversing Princess Anne's decision would risk signaling weakness inside a monarchy already struggling to maintain authority after years of relentless scrutiny. But others allegedly believed Charles also understood the emotional damage the confrontation could inflict permanently on Harry and Meghan's relationship with the palace. That internal conflict reportedly left him isolated during some of the most volatile days Buckingham Palace had experienced in recent memory. And while Charles wrestled privately with impossible choices, another shift was quietly becoming impossible for insiders to ignore. According to palace sources, the growing alignment between Prince William and Princess Anne had strengthened dramatically after the incident. What once appeared to be isolated frustrations about protocol, trust, and royal discipline now looked increasingly like a shared institutional philosophy shaping the monarchy's future direction. Stability first. Duty first. Structure first. Even if emotional reconciliation had to be sacrificed in the process. Sources claimed several senior aides began privately discussing what this could mean once William eventually ascends the throne. Some feared the monarchy's next era would become far colder, more controlled, and significantly less tolerant of unpredictability or emotional conflict within the royal structure. Others argued such firmness was necessary for survival after years of public scandals, media warfare, and internal instability threatened to weaken the institution's credibility worldwide. But regardless of opinion, insiders agreed on one thing. The blocked entrance confrontation had exposed just how deep the divide inside the royal family had truly become. For Harry and Meghan, sources claimed the emotional consequences reportedly went far beyond one humiliating moment at Buckingham Palace. According to insiders familiar with private conversations, both increasingly viewed the silence surrounding Anne's actions as proof that the monarchy no longer saw reconciliation as its highest priority. The refusal of senior royals to publicly soften the incident reportedly deepened fears that the palace was intentionally creating colder, more permanent institutional boundaries around non-working members of the family. And within royal culture, symbolic gestures carry enormous weight. A denied entrance can communicate exclusion more powerfully than public statements ever could. Palace communications teams allegedly remained in quiet crisis mode throughout the fallout, terrified another devastating media war could erupt without warning. Some aides reportedly spent nights drafting contingency plans for interviews, leaks, documentaries, or public accusations that had not yet happened but already felt inevitable. Others privately admitted they feared the monarchy had entered a dangerous phase where emotional wounds between both sides might never fully heal again. According to insiders, several staff members who once believed time could eventually repair family relationships now quietly feared the divide had hardened into something permanent. Yet perhaps the most chilling development came as whispers spread regarding Princess Anne's rising influence inside palace operations. Sources close to royal households claimed her standing reportedly became even stronger after the confrontation rather than weaker. Senior officials increasingly viewed her as one of the monarchy's last uncompromising defenders during a time of extraordinary instability. To supporters inside palace walls, Anne represented discipline, order, and loyalty to the institution above personal emotion. But critics quietly worried her growing authority signaled the beginning of a harsher royal era, one where survival of the crown mattered more than preserving emotional unity within the family itself. And as debates intensified privately behind closed doors, the public outside Buckingham Palace remained divided as well. Some observers praised Anne's firmness, arguing the monarchy could not continue functioning if protocol and structure were repeatedly weakened by emotional pressure or public controversy. Others viewed the confrontation as deeply troubling proof that the royal institution was becoming colder, more defensive, and increasingly consumed by internal power struggles hidden beneath ceremonial tradition. Social media exploded with speculation. Royal commentators dissected every detail. Journalists searched desperately for confirmation of what truly happened behind palace walls. But according to insiders, the most important truth was something the public still could not fully see. This was never simply about one doorway, one restriction, or one uncomfortable confrontation between family members. It was about trust, about power, about who the monarchy still viewed as fully inside the institution, and who now stood outside its invisible inner boundaries. And that realization reportedly terrified many palace aides more than the scandal itself. Because once an institution built entirely on loyalty begins questioning who truly belongs within it, every relationship inside the structure becomes vulnerable. By the final days of the crisis, insiders claimed Buckingham Palace had entered what some privately described as a new royal reality. One where emotional compromise no longer guaranteed protection. One where discipline and institutional survival increasingly overpowered personal reconciliation. One where silence itself became a weapon stronger than public statements. And according to several senior sources, the coldest part may still be ahead. Because behind the palace gates, fears continue growing that the monarchy's invisible walls are rising higher than ever before, and that future confrontations between the Sussexes and the royal institution may become even more distant, formal, and unforgiving than anything seen so far. What began with one quietly blocked entrance may ultimately be remembered as the moment Buckingham Palace stopped trying to repair the fracture, and instead began learning how to live with it permanently. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments below. Do you think Princess Anne was protecting the monarchy, or did the palace go too far this time? And stay tuned, because the next royal revelation may already be unfolding behind closed doors.